You might think that being part of a royal family in history meant living a life of luxury, golden palaces, silk sheets, and limitless power. But if you woke up tomorrow as a woman in the Ottoman Sultan's harem, there would be a 99% chance you wouldn't live to see your 30th birthday. Behind those golden walls were 400 women, trapped like birds in a silk cage, where a simple biological cycle could become a death sentence. Getting pregnant without permission meant being sewn into animal skin and thrown into the sea. After every night with the Sultan, 12 men surrounded you to decide if you were still worthy of keeping your body intact. Before we begin, like this video and hit the subscribe button. Welcome to the dark side of history your textbooks desperately want you to forget. Let me take you inside the most beautiful nightmare of the Ottoman Empire, the Imperial Harem of Topkapi Palace. This isn't the romantic version of belly dancers and sweet delights shown in movies. It's a documented reality, an industrial-scale femicide disguised as luxury. For 5 centuries, the Ottoman Empire perfected a system so perverse that even European envoys, men who believed burning witches was reasonable, were horrified by what they saw. But here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't random cruelty. It was an organized system with rules, hierarchy, and bureaucratic precision that would make modern HR departments look chaotic. Every death was recorded. Every execution followed a protocol. Every broken woman was the outcome of a calculated decision. The empire wants you to remember its architecture, its conquests, its art, but not the silver tray that decided women's fates, nor the basement rooms where childhood ended, nor the Bosphorus turned into a mass grave. So buckle up, because over the next hour, I'll take you through 7 aspects of this palace of nightmares that'll make you grateful for every boring day of your modern life. And trust me, by the end of it, you'll never look at a history book the same way again. Let's begin with the nightly terror that made 400 women pray to be forgotten. Every evening, as the sun set over Istanbul, a ritual began, one that turned the palace into a gambling hall, with women's lives as the stakes. Picture this: 400 women aged 13 to 25, sitting in the most beautiful prison ever built, waiting to learn if this would be their night, a night that could either elevate them to power or lead them to death. The selection process was disturbingly simple. In the Sultan's private chambers, a silver tray was prepared with small parchment slips, each bearing a woman's name. The Sultan didn't even choose personally. That would mean taking responsibility. Instead, eunuchs drew names, turning the women's lives into a deadly lottery. Imagine your name being pulled from a bowl, knowing your reward could be death. The most disturbing part? They had to look grateful. Any sign of fear, hesitation, or physical impurity brought instant punishment. You won't find this in your school history books, but these women lived in constant terror of their own biology. According to palace records from 1640, the ritual began precisely at 8 in the evening. The chief black eunuch, a man named Sumbul Aga, entered the harem halls. The women were gathered in the golden chamber, standing in rows like items on display. The silver tray was carried through the corridors by 2 junior eunuchs, while guards cleared the path. The journey from the Sultan's quarters to the harem took exactly 12 minutes. It was timed. On March 15, 1640, a woman named Ai was chosen. Records show she was 17 from Sivas and had spent 3 years in the harem. When the eunuchs came for her, they discovered she had started her menstrual cycle. The Ottoman Empire would rather you forget what happened next. She never lived to see the morning. The official record lists her death as a sudden illness. The truth is, she paid the price for a biological function she couldn't control. But the selection was only the beginning of the nightmare. Documents reveal something even darker. If a woman was chosen and deemed suitable, she was taken to the preparation rooms, surrounded by 12 eunuchs, men trained as medical inspectors. They asked one question that determined her fate: whether to preserve the seed. This wasn't poetic language. It was a clinical judgment of whether a woman was allowed to keep her reproductive organs. If the answer was no, a procedure was carried out. If yes, she was sent to the Sultan's chambers, knowing that any failure to conceive within a certain time would bring that same dreadful question again. The statistics paint a horrifying picture. Out of 400 women in the harem at any given time, only about 10 would ever bear children. The rest lived in constant waiting, knowing that being forgotten was the best possible outcome. Because here's what the textbooks don't tell you: multiple selections without producing an heir meant you became a burden. On March 3, 1652, according to palace records, 23 women were relocated overnight. All of them had been chosen multiple times and had failed to conceive. Their destination was never recorded. Official records refer to it simply as reassignment, but the testimonies of servants tell a different story, one tied to the dark waters of the Bosphorus. And it gets worse. The psychological torture of the selection system was entirely intentional. Dr. Fatma Göçek, a modern historian of the Ottoman Empire, discovered documents proving that even the illusion of randomness was carefully calibrated. They wanted the women to feel just enough hope to prevent mass despair, but never enough to feel safe. It was psychological warfare, perfected over centuries. The selection process also served another purpose that most people overlook. It turned victims against each other. Instead of uniting against their oppressors, the women competed for survival. They sabotaged rivals, reported one another's menstrual cycle, and even celebrated when others were reassigned. The system transformed victims into accomplices. A French ambassador, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, wrote in 1675 that women of the Serai lived in such fear of the silver tray that many resorted to potions that destroyed their fertility, choosing guaranteed barrenness over the uncertainty of selection. Think about that. Women permanently damaging their bodies just to avoid the chance of being chosen. What history books rarely mention is the economy behind this horror. Every woman in the harem represented a financial investment. They were bought, trained, clothed, and fed. The Ottoman Empire spent the equivalent of $2 million modern dollars every year just to maintain the harem, but they justified it because the system served multiple goals: preserving bloodline purity, preventing political alliances through marriage, and maintaining total control over succession. Religious law was twisted beyond recognition to support it. Natural biological functions were declared impure, not by scripture, but by palace administrators who needed excuses for disposal. Pregnancy outside the official process was considered theft from the Sultan, as if women's bodies were state property. Only now are modern historians uncovering the full scale of this system. Digital analysis of palace records has revealed patterns missed for centuries. The selections weren't truly random. Women from certain regions were chosen more often. Preference was given to those aged 16 to 18, and anyone showing signs of intelligence or education was deliberately overlooked. The Sultan wanted bodies, not minds. It makes modern dating apps look like paradise, doesn't it? Today we swipe left or right. Back then, a stroke of a pen could mean death. We complain about being ghosted. They dealt with real ghosts. Your worst Tinder date would have been better than their best night in the palace. And yet, within this machine, built to destroy women, one 15-year-old girl not only survived, but won. She beat the death lottery by becoming something far darker than her captors. Her story proves that sometimes the only way to survive hell is to become the demon yourself. Let's talk about the 15-year-old girl who outplayed the system and became one of history's most calculating survivors. Her name was Alexandra Lisowska, though the world remembers her as Roxolana or Hurrem Sultan. And if you think you know what manipulation is, wait until you hear how this teenager turned systematic abuse into a path to absolute power. It was 1520, in the countryside of Ukraine. A 15-year-old girl helped her father, an Orthodox priest, prepare for Sunday service. She was gathering wildflowers in the wheat fields when Crimean Tatars appeared on the horizon. Within hours, her world was erased, her family murdered, her village burned, and she was chained among dozens of other girls. Their destination, the slave markets of Istanbul. Imagine being torn from your home at 15, realizing your only way to survive is to become a monster. That's exactly what Alexandra did. What makes her story truly disturbing is that she didn't just adapt to the system that enslaved her. She mastered it, manipulated it, and ultimately made it serve her. Her transformation began the moment she entered the palace. While other girls cried for their families, Alexandra observed. She understood that tears meant weakness, and weakness meant death. So she created Roxolana, a persona so perfectly constructed that over time, even she forgot who Alexandra had been. Documented evidence of her calculated rise is staggering. Palace records from 1521 show that within 6 months of arriving, she spoke Turkish, Arabic, and Persian fluently, not conversationally, but flawlessly. Other women recalled seeing her practice until her mouth bled, repeating phrases again and again until her accent vanished. She understood that language wasn't just communication, it was camouflage. But language was only her first weapon. The truly unsettling part was how she studied Sultan Suleiman himself, piece by piece, like solving a riddle. She memorized his daily routines, his preferences, his moods. When he enjoyed poetry, she became a poet. When he turned to politics, she spoke in a way that always complemented him perfectly. She wasn't just his reflection, she became his intellectual equal. What history books never mention is how Roxolana pioneered techniques of psychological manipulation that wouldn't be formally studied for another 4 centuries. She mastered what modern psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, always unpredictable. She made Suleiman addicted to trying to understand her. In 1524, she staged her first major act of manipulation. A fire broke out in the palace, not unusual for wooden buildings lit by oil lamps. While everyone panicked and ran for safety, Roxolana stayed behind, risking her life to save Suleiman's favorite book of poems. But what most people don't realize is that modern forensic analysis suggests the fire began in a storage room, one only Roxolana had access to. She created a crisis just to become the hero. Her true genius revealed itself a decade later in the so-called marriage coup of 1534. For 500 years, Ottoman sultans never married. They took concubine, had children, but marriage was forbidden to avoid succession disputes. Roxolana changed that. She convinced Suleiman that their love was greater than tradition. Historians have found her letters from that period, masterclasses in emotional manipulation. Every word was deliberate, every feeling precisely calibrated to push the sultan toward breaking half a millennium of royal protocol. That's where the story turns truly dark. After the wedding, Roxolana's instinct for survival transformed into something monstrous. She and Suleiman had 6 children, but that wasn't enough. The rightful heir, Prince Mustafa, was Suleiman's son by another woman. He was popular, competent, and by all accounts destined to be a great ruler, which meant he had to go. It took Roxolana 3 years to orchestrate his death. She didn't use poison or assassins. Instead, she planted doubt. Her agents spread rumors of Mustafa's ambition. She forged letters hinting at rebellion. She arranged for Suleiman to overhear whispers of his son's growing influence. Each clue could be denied. Each rumor was untraceable. In 1553, Suleiman ordered the execution of his own son. Roxolana watched from behind a curtain as the most promising prince of the Ottoman Empire was strangled for a crime she had invented. Witnesses said she showed no emotion. She had become exactly what the system demanded, a survivor without a conscience. Her poems from that time reveal the horror of her transformation. On the surface, they read like tender love verses to the Sultan, but now, with what we know, they sound like psychological warfare. One poem translates, "My Sultan, the only light of my life. Without you, there is only endless night. Your wisdom sees what others cannot. Your justice flows like an infinite sea." She wrote those lines just a week before manipulating him into killing his own son. Every phrase reinforced his paranoia as wisdom, his cruelty as justice. She had learned the ultimate lesson of the harem, that love itself could be a weapon. Yet the most disturbing part of Roxolana's story isn't what she did, but why she had to do it. The Ottoman system had no retirement for aging concubines. Once her children grew up, once Suleiman's passion faded, she would have been disposed of like thousands before her. Her monstrous acts were a rational response to an irrational system. Documents discovered in 2018 show she maintained a network of over 150 informants across the palace. She knew every plot, every whisper, every potential threat to her sons. She turned the harem's culture of betrayal into her own intelligence service. The oppressed had become the oppressor. But can we really blame her? Modern historians struggle with Roxolana's legacy. Dr. Leslie Pierce, who wrote her definitive biography, calls her a feminist icon hiding the resume of a war criminal. She shattered gender barriers, became a political advisor, a patron of architecture, and a diplomatic correspondent, but she was also directly responsible for at least 40 deaths, including children who stood in her son's way. Today, we'd call it the survivor's syndrome. She called it Tuesday. Every morning, she woke beside the man who owned her in a palace built on human bondage, smiling as she wrote him love poems, while her other hand signed death orders. In impossible systems, survival often costs your soul, and Roxolana paid in full. She died in 1558, the only woman in Ottoman history buried beside a sultan. She had beaten the system by becoming worse than the system itself. From the daughter of a Ukrainian priest to a slave, from a concubine to a queen to a killer, her trauma forged history's most calculating survivor. Her final letter to Suleiman, written on her deathbed, remains one of the most chilling documents in Ottoman history. "My Sultan, I go ahead to prepare paradise for your arrival. Every decision I made was for our dynasty. History will remember our love. Let the rest be forgotten." She knew exactly what she had done, and she felt no remorse. Inside the gilded walls of the Ottoman Palace, where 397 out of every 400 women died forgotten, Roxolana made a terrifying choice: to live as a monster rather than die as a victim. And here lies the most disturbing question. If we were placed in the same inescapable system, how many of us would make the same choice? But Roxolana was the exception. Most women didn't have her mind, her luck, or her ruthlessness. They couldn't manipulate their way into power or kill their way into safety. For them, the palace had other plans, methods of disposal so refined, so civilized, that medieval torture chambers would almost seem honest in comparison. This was where the Ottoman palace transformed into a factory of creative executions. And creative is not an exaggeration. There were no public hangings or beheadings here. The Ottomans had a unique problem. They needed to regularly remove women from the harem. But Islamic law forbade spilling noble blood, and religious principles demanded clean deaths. So they innovated. Killing became an art form, silk and seawater the tools, human suffering the medium. The palace even employed professional stranglers. Their official title was Bostancer, the gardeners. Only these men didn't prune roses. They pruned the Sultan's human garden. They were handpicked for discretion, trained in anatomy, and practiced on animals until they could take a life in less than 30 seconds. And in this world, even your own body could betray you. A single natural cycle, a fainting spell, or a rumor of illness could sign your death warrant. Silk strangulation wasn't random. It was deliberate. It left no blood, no marks, and it was silent. A clean death for a woman now deemed unclean. The Bostancer used a method passed down through generations. 3 feet of silk cord, twisted 7 times for strength. One man held the woman's shoulders, while the other completed the act. The process was so standardized that there was even a form of quality control. If it took more than 45 seconds, the executioner himself was punished, not for killing, but for causing excessive suffering. The Ottomans, in their bureaucratic perfection, had performance reviews for murder. And yet, what most history books fail to mention is the psychological torture that came first. Women marked for death weren't killed right away. They were told at sunset and executed at dawn. One final night to prepare their souls. Palace records show that many spent those hours writing letters that would never be delivered, to families they would never see again. Some prayed, others sang softly until sunrise. None slept. Then there was the sea punishment. The Ottoman Empire would rather history forget this, but it's carefully documented in European diplomatic reports. Women who became pregnant without permission faced deniz cezası, the sentence of the sea. They were sewn into leather sacks with several cats, not for companionship. The animals were there to claw and thrash, to create chaos and panic, ensuring the woman couldn't hold her breath or rise to the surface. The execution squad had a dedicated black-painted boat used only on moonless night. They rowed to a precise point in the Bosphorus, where the current would carry the bodies into the Black Sea. The most chilling detail is that this was considered merciful. Compared to the brutal executions of adulterous women in Christian Europe, the Ottomans believed they were progressive. From 1520 to 1680, palace archives suggest that at least 3,000 women met their deaths this way, 18 every year for 160 years. The Bosphorus became so associated with the drowned that local fishermen began avoiding certain spots, calling them the mermaid cemeteries. But not all executions required blood or water. Sometimes the cruelest death was no death at all. Exile to the Eski Saray, the old palace, was a slow psychological death. Women who had aged out of beauty or committed small offences were sent, there to fade away. No visits, no letters, no hope. A French diplomat who visited in 1670 described it as a marble tomb filled with living ghosts. The girls who entered young left as corpses, if they ever left at all. The silence was so heavy, one could almost hear hearts breaking. The economics of death were calculated with bureaucratic precision. A silk strangulation cost 3 akçe, the price of a good meal. A drowning expedition cost 20, including the boat rental and crew wages. Exile cost nothing but the transport. The empire even kept detailed ledgers of execution expenses. Murder was a line item in the palace budget. And here's the bitter truth few acknowledge. The men who carried out these acts weren't monsters. They were palace employees, fathers, husbands, men with families, Many suffered severe psychological breakdowns. Medical records from the early 17th century show that the Bostonser had the highest rates of melancholy and nightmares among all palace staff. One executioner's diary, discovered in 1987, contains over 400 pages of apologies, written not to God, but to the women whose lives he took. The bureaucracy of death extended even to record keeping. Every execution was logged in triplicate, noting the date, time, method, cause, and, notably, a satisfaction rating from the supervising officials. There were literally customer service standards for murder. A good execution was quick, silent, and left no evidence, while a bad one caused complications or dragged on. Religious justification made all of this possible. Palace clerics issued fatwas declaring that women who disturbed harmony spread corruption, and their elimination was not only permissible but necessary. They cited sacred texts, effectively turning scripture into execution orders. The psychological gymnastics required to reconcile mercy with murder gave rise to an entire theological subcategory. The most horrifying method of execution was reserved for women who tried to escape. They faced the tash suyu, or stone punishment, not stoning, as one might imagine. Instead, they were bricked alive within the palace walls. Archaeologists restoring Topkapi Palace in 2010 discovered human remains embedded in several walls, confirming long-standing rumors. These women were literally erased from existence, becoming part of the structure that imprisoned them. Compared to this, medieval European executions seemed almost merciful. They were public spectacles with a twisted sense of justice, whereas this was private erasure on an industrial scale, leaving no martyrs, no cautionary tales, only empty beds to be filled by new arrivals. The perverse logic of humane killing reached its peak in the development of poisoning protocols for higher status women, those who had borne children or held titles. Strangulation was deemed too degrading, so they were given a special sherbet, flavored with almonds, that acted over several hours. The palace employed a chief poisoner who maintained a garden of toxic plants and tested new formulas on condemned criminals. But the palace didn't just consume women, it also devoured children. If you thought the harem system was horrifying, wait until you hear about the devshirme, the child collection system that makes modern human trafficking look amateurish. At least contemporary traffickers try to hide their crimes. The Ottomans made it official state policy. If women suffered, 12-year-old boys were in for an even worse fate. The Ottoman Empire didn't wait for slaves to come to it. They had a system so efficient it would make Amazon jealous. It was called devshirme, literally meaning collection or recruitment. The term sounds innocuous, as if they were collecting taxes or tribute, but the tribute was human lives. Every 3 to 7 years, Ottoman officials traveled through Christian territories, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Albania, to select boys, as if they were livestock. This was no metaphor. There were literal specifications, height requirements, dental exams, intelligence tests. The empire maintained strict quality control standards for abducting children. Imagine government officials arriving to evaluate your son like livestock. The scene unfolded the same in every village. Ottoman soldiers would surround the settlement. At dawn, while a collector positioned himself in the town square, all Christian boys aged 8 to 18 were required to appear. Muslim boys were exempt, creating a perverse incentive for families to convert, even though this was often prohibited. The selection process was thorough and terrifying. Boys were stripped naked in public, inspected for physical defects, tested for intelligence and strength. Officials examined their teeth as if buying horses, measured height and assessed muscle tone. Parents watched as their children were evaluated like meat, knowing selection meant they might see them for the last time. Quotas required each region to provide a set number of boys based on population. If sufficient candidates weren't found, standards were lowered. In bad years, boys as young as 6 or over 20 could be taken. The only absolute requirement was that they be Christian, outside Islamic law protections. Selected boys were literally marked with tattoos or brands identifying them as devshirme. Then began what survivors later called the Death March. The journey to Istanbul could take months. Boys from the Balkans walked up to 1,000 kilometers, chained in groups of 100, with no wagons or horses. Walking was part of the breaking process. Weak boys died along the way. Economic savings. For the empire and preparation for future janissaries, survivors arrived in Istanbul traumatized, exhausted, and subdued. Ottoman records indicate a 20% mortality rate during transport, 1 in 5 boys dead before training even began. The empire considered this acceptable loss, natural, Selection for future soldiers. One European merchant in 1544 described encountering a column of devshirme, a river of children flowing toward Constantinople. Every few miles, the chain shortened as fallen boys were cut loose and left behind. Mothers followed at a distance, crying until soldiers chased them away, a harvest of grief. Upon arrival in Istanbul, psychological conditioning intensified. Boys were given new Muslim names, marking the beginning of their forced assimilation into the imperial system. Their Christian names were forbidden, and using them was punishable by beatings. They were circumcised, often without anesthesia, as a physical mark of their new identity. They were forbidden to speak their native languages, and boys caught praying in their original faith were severely punished. But here's the most insidious part. The system was designed to create fanatic, successful boys became zealots, more devoted to the Sultan than any natural subject could be. These stolen children became elite Janissary soldiers, who would later raid Christian villages to abduct more children. The oppressed became oppressors, perpetuating the cycle. Training schools, called Enderun, were centers of psychological reprogramming. Boys studied Turkish, Arabic, martial arts, and absolute obedience. But the real training happened after lessons. Older boys, already broken and remade, applied the system to the newcomers. Not every child needed to be traumatized by the instructors. The children did it to each other. European observers were uniformly horrified. The Austrian ambassador wrote in 1562 that they took Christian children and returned them as perfect enemies of Christ. The transformation was so complete that these boys would joyfully kill their own fathers if ordered. It was a factory that stole souls and produced weapons. The numbers are staggering. Between 1450 and 1650, the Ottoman Empire collected roughly 200,000 Christian boys, about 1,000 per year for 2 centuries. Entire regions were depleted of young men. In some villages, the Enderun had no boys aged 10 to 18 for generations. Parents devised desperate strategies to save their children. They mutilated them, cutting off toes to make them unfit for service, married them off early, as married boys were sometimes exempt, hid them in mountains or monasteries. Some even killed their sons rather than let them be taken. Devshirme turned parents either into accomplices or killers. The economic impact was calculated and cruel. By abducting children, the empire saved enormous recruitment costs, removed potential rebels, and created administrators and soldiers without loyalties or family ties. From a cold bureaucratic standpoint, it was brilliant. From a human standpoint, it was industrialized violence against children. Some Devshirme boys achieved incredible heights. Grand viziers, provincial governors, military commanders. Defenders of the system point to these success stories, claiming the boys gained opportunities they would never have had in their villages. But the fact that 1 in 100 became powerful does not justify the theft of the other 99. Today, we would call this human trafficking and systematic abuse, punishable under international law. At the time, it was official policy in one of the world's most powerful empires. It was so routine that Ottoman historians wrote about it with the casualness of a tax collection report. The psychological damage passed from generation to generation. Modern studies of Bulgarian folklore reveal recurring nightmares of demons stealing children. Genetic research shows demographic bottlenecks in certain regions corresponding to periods of Devshirme collection. Trauma was literally encoded into DNA and cultural memory. The last official Devshirme recruitment occurred in 1648, though unofficial. Collections continued into the 17th century. The system ended, not because of moral awakening, but economic inefficiency. Firearms reduced the need for elite infantry, and Muslim families began bribing officials to protect their children. The distorted system collapsed under its own perverse logic. The most disturbing truth is that many of these boys were never meant for the army. The most beautiful, the frailest, the smartest, these had a different fate. They were sent to palace, schools where education meant something far darker than reading and writing. The same halls that taught mathematics instructed children that their bodies were currency. Welcome to the Enderun Palace School, where the Ottoman Empire created perfect servants through a curriculum that would make modern child protection. Agencies mobilize entire armies. This was not education. It was systematic conditioning using children as raw material. The palace school was located in the third courtyard of Topkapi Palace, architecturally beautiful, with marble columns and ornate tile work, but the beauty masked horror. Behind these richly decorated doors, 0 to 4 boys, aged 10 to 18, lived in a hierarchical system so perverse that survivors rarely spoke of it, and when they did, their accounts were dismissed as exaggeration. Recent archaeological findings suggest they understated reality. Imagine attending a school where your grades depended not only on test scores, where advancement required sacrifices not only of mind, but of body, where teachers had absolute power and students had no voice because the concept didn't exist. Such was daily life in Enderun. The official curriculum looked impressive. Languages, mathematics, Islamic theology, music, calligraphy, martial arts. Boys learned to speak multiple languages fluently, solve complex equations, compose poetry, and fight with various weapons. On paper, it was one of the most advanced educational institutions in the world. In practice, it was a training factory. The night program began after the end of official lessons. The dormitories operated on a strict hierarchy. New boys, called Isolan, occupied the lowest rung. Above them were the Falaka, and at the top, the Hasoda. This was not merely an organization, it was a structure of predation. Older students had rights over the younger ones, rights that were codified, systematized, and enforced by the school administration. A French observer in 1650 wrote that beautiful boys were passed from hand to hand like common property. Those who resisted were beaten or starved, while those who submitted received privileges. Teachers didn't just know about it, they orchestrated it. In the palace, there were special terms for these arrangements. The senior student claiming a younger boy was called La, and the junior became their Cholan. The language of the court disguised abuse as mentorship. Palace records show these. Guardianships were registered, taxed, and treated as contracts of property. Twice-yearly school exhibitions were not mere academic presentations. Boys were dressed in special outfits, tight trousers and open vests, made up and displayed before courtiers, officials, and invited sons of the nobility. The Austrian ambassador reported in 1665 that they paint the boys as women and make them dance, shaming prostitutes. Spectators bet on their favorites. Modern historians have found accounting books from these events. Boys were rented for private lessons, the school keeping 60% of the earnings, with the remaining 40% credited to the boy upon completion, if he survived. They literally accumulated money earned from their own suffering. Medical examinations tell their own horrific story. Palace doctors kept detailed records of injury, illnesses, and treatments. Reading between the lines of clinical language reveals systematic abuse. 40% of students had rectal fissures, throat infections were epidemic, and a melancholic temperament requiring isolation was treated as a form of attempted self-harm. Suicide rates were staggering but concealed. Boys who killed themselves were recorded as having died of sudden illness or accident. A palace guard's diary discovered in 1923 lists 31 boys who fell from the same tower between 1640 and 1645. Protective railings existed, and the guard knew they jumped, but he was ordered to report it as accidental. Psychological manipulation accompanied physical abuse. Boys were indoctrinated to believe their suffering was sacred, that obedience made them better Muslims, and that resistance was a sign of spiritual weakness. Palace and religious authorities issued decrees stating that serving older students was a form of worship. Scriptures were distorted to normalize trauma. Those who attempted escape faced inventive punishments designed to break their spirit without damaging valuable assets. The marble procedure forced them to stand naked on cold marble for hours. The room of silence was solitary confinement, with sensory deprivation. The memory hall was a pit where boys were lowered and left in darkness, fed only minimally to survive. European visitors were horrified yet complicit. The Venetian ambassador wrote in 1670 that what he saw in the palace school would be deemed diabolical in Christian lands, yet his compatriots were betting heavily for evening entertainment. Graduates fell into three categories. Some became janissaries, or administrators, channeling trauma into fanatical loyalty. Others became palace eunuchs, physically altered to serve in the harem. And a third group, broken beyond function, was quietly eliminated. Most people do not realize that this system produced the empire's most effective administrators. Grandi, viziers, military commanders, provincial governors, many products of the palace schools. Their shared trauma created unbreakable bonds, ensuring loyalty to each other and the system that shaped them. The training methods were so effective that other states attempted to replicate them. Safavid Persia created similar schools, and the Mughal Empire imported Ottoman teachers. The system spread because it worked, if by worked we mean creating utterly loyal, completely broken servants. One survivor's account from 1701, after fleeing to Venice, provides a rare insight. They took my name, my faith, my innocence. They gave me knowledge, power, and nightmares that lasted a lifetime. I speak 7 languages but scream in my mother tongue. I command 1,000, yet cannot stop the memories. Modern complaints about education seem trivial in comparison. While we fret over standardized tests and homework, they feared surviving until morning. We argue over uniform. They were dressed for auctions. We complain about boring teachers. They faced predators with lesson plans. The palace school finally closed in 1909 during the Young Turk Revolution. The building still stands as part of the Topkapi Palace Museum. Tourists walk the halls where children were broken, admiring architecture. Built on suffering, guidebooks mention the excellent education provided. They don't mention the cost, but the numbers don't lie. Even when history demands its due, the Ottoman Empire ordered meticulous records, financial statements, population censuses, execution lists. When you collect this data, patterns emerge that reveal the mass scale of femicide and systematic violence against children. The mathematics of suffering paints a picture the empire tried to hide. Let's talk statistics that expose industrial scale femicide. The Ottoman Empire kept accounts like a modern corporation. Every purchase, every death, every missing woman catalogued in ledgers that survived even when the women themselves did not. When historians finally accessed these archives in the 1960s, what they discovered challenged every romanticized notion of life. The numbers do not lie. 400 women entered, and only 3 survived to old age. This is not hyperbole or estimation. It is documented fact from palace records covering 1520 to 1580. For every success story like Roxolana, 130 women simply vanished into historical silence. Their names appeared in admission journals and expense reports. Then nothing. They became statistical ghosts. Imagine your name drawn from a hat, but instead of winning a prize, you might lose your life. Now imagine this happening to 397 out of 400 women. This is not chance, it is systematic elimination on silk pillows. Here's how the horrifying math looks. The average harem held 0 to 4 women at any given time. The average tenure was 4 to 7, 10 years. Not because women were released or married, but because they died or disappeared. Turnover was so high that the palace had recruitment quotas, 100 new women annually, just to maintain numbers. Age demographics speak volumes. The average age of entry was 14 to 16. The median age in the harem was 19. By 25, women were considered mature. By 30, elderly. Finding a woman over 35 in the general harem was so rare, she was a statistical anomaly. Where did they go? Palace expense reports give clues. The relocation budget averaged 3,000 gold coins annually, enough to transport roughly 150 women. Destinations listed in the records included Eski Saray, provincial postings, and a euphemistic category, special orders. Trail money leads to ferry operators across the Bosporus, paid regularly for night trips. Death certificates, when they existed, reveal astonishing coincidences. Between 1550 and 1650, palace records document the deaths of 847 women from sudden illness, 620 from melancholy, 445 from accidents, 234 from unknown causes, and 89 from childbirth complications, a total of 2,238 deaths in a century, with a population never exceeding 4 at a time. Replacement was so complete that the female part of the harem was effectively renewed every 5 years. Those not chosen suffered a different death, psychological annihilation. Of the 4 women in a harem, only 10-15 were ever selected by the Sultan. The rest lived in eternal waiting. They were fed, clothed, trained, and forgotten. Imagine spending your entire youth preparing for a moment that will never come, trapped in a prison you can never leave. Financial investment in this system of death was staggering. Each woman cost about 50 gold coins to purchase, 20 annually, for upkeep, and 5 for transfer. The Ottoman Empire spent around 40,000 gold coins per year on the harem, equivalent to $8.1 million today. They literally budgeted for systematic killings, allocating funds for silk cords and nocturnal boat trips. Visualizing it as human hourglasses makes it clear. Imagine 400 grains at the top, young women entering the harem. The narrow middle represents the few chosen by the sultans. The bottom shows where they end up. 3 grains survive, 397 scatter to the wind. These hourglasses reset every 5 years for 500 years. Cross-checking palace records with city death registries reveals alarming gaps. Women leaving the palace rarely appear in any other official document. They vanish from marriage records, tax lists, or death certificates elsewhere. They simply ceased to exist bureaucratically. The empire perfected the art of making people invisible. Modern human trafficking pales in comparison. Considering scale, current estimates suggest 40 million people are trapped in modern slavery worldwide. The Ottoman Empire, with a fraction of today's population, passed approximately 200,000 women through the harem system over 500 years. Adjusted for population, that would be equivalent to 10 million today. Medical records are equally revealing. Palace physicians documented widespread malnutrition, despite food abundance, and epidemic levels of hysteria and melancholy. The level of accidents and sudden illnesses was extraordinarily high. Pregnancy rates were significantly below biological norms, and the efficiency of replacement spoke for itself. When the plague struck Istanbul in 1625, killing 60 women in the harem in a single week, the palace completely replenished the losses within 2 months. They had human supply chains more efficient than military logistics. Slave markets from the Caucasus to Sunnah maintained constant orders. One statistical anomaly deserves special attention. During the reign of Sultan Ibrahim, mortality in the harem spiked by 300%. His particular tastes demanded larger women, so hundreds of unsuitable inhabitants were eliminated to make room. The bureaucracy of death scaled without hesitation. They tripled the relocation budget and increased the frequency of shipping runs. Intergenerational trauma becomes visible in the birth statistics. Women who survived and became valid as sultans averaged only 3.1 children, far below the biological norm for the era. Even those who won the harem lottery bore physical and psychological damage affecting reproductive capacity. The system literally broke women's bodies. But the most chilling statistic concerns normalization. New arrivals showed signs of severe stress for 6 months. After that, they adapted. They stopped trying to escape, stopped crying, accepted their fate. The palace calculated precisely how long it took to break the human spirit and built its training programs around that. Modern economists studying Ottoman records have calculated the profitability of oppression. Each woman generated an average economic value of 200 gold coins through labor, entertainment, and reproductive potential, while total costs amounted to 75 coins, a 166% return on investment. The empire profited from systematic femicide. The horror of bureaucratized killing becomes clear when you see the documents. Real government forms with checkboxes for methods of elimination, ratings of execution efficiency, and budgetary complications for transporting corpses. They turned murder into paperwork, suffering into spreadsheets. But how did this 500-year nightmare finally end? It required the collapse of an entire civilization to stop this systematic horror. Even then, the system fought for survival. Its defenders using every tool, from religion to economics, to justify the unjustifiable. The end began with the Tanzimat reforms of 1839. Sultan Abdulmajid III, under pressure from European powers and internal reformers, issued the Gulhane Hatta Sharif, an imperial edict from the Rose Garden. Poetic, yes, but this rose garden was fertilized with the bones of 1,000 women, and the roses carried thorns of resistance. Imagine being torn from your family at 15, deciding that the only way to survive is to become a monster. Now imagine being a palace official who has profited for 40 years from this system. The reforms threatened your income, status, and access to disposable people. These people did not go quietly. Resistance was immediate and brutal. Palace eunuchs organized what historians now call the Harem Rebellion of 1840. They spread rumors that abolishing slavery would anger Allah, bribed clergy to issue fatwas declaring the reform sinful, and accidentally strangled 3 reformist officials. The message was clear. Change meant war. Most people don't realize that the strongest resistance came from within the harem itself. Many elderly women, especially the Valid Sultan and senior Khalifas, fought against reform. They had survived by becoming part of the system. Freedom threatened their power. Stockholm Syndrome had become institutionalized. Attempts at reform exposed how deeply the horror was entrenched. The Abolition Decree of 1854 explicitly excluded the imperial harem. The 1876 Constitution guaranteed human rights, except for palace women. Every step forward included loopholes to maintain the collection of the Sultan's people. It was like trying to end slavery while keeping the plantation. Real change required outside intervention. The Young Turk Revolution brought in military officers unconnected to the harem system by 1908. They occupied the palace, documented the horrors, and began freeing women. What they discovered shocked even seasoned soldiers. The last generation of harem women told stories historians are still trying to comprehend. One woman, freed in 1909 at age 60, had lived in the palace since she was 12. She did not know her real name and had no memories of life outside the walls. When offered freedom, she begged to stay. The outside world frightened her more than her silk prison. The testimony of Sophia Noura, recorded in 1924, reflects the tragedy. They tell me I am now free to do what I know, 13 ways to please a man I never loved. I speak 4 languages, but have no one to talk to. I can recite poetry, but cannot read a street sign. We were given an education for slavery, and they called it culture. Today, tourists take selfies in the very places where women once faced execution. Topkapi Palace receives 3 million visitors every year. They stroll through the harem quarters, now a museum, snapping pictures of beautiful tiles and golden lantern. Guides mention the concubines who were mothers of sultans, but they do not speak of the silk cords used for strangulation or drownings in the Bosporus. Souvenir shops sell Ottoman-style jewelry and Herm Knight's perfume, and marketing materials describe a mysterious world of beautiful women living in luxury. The word slavery is nowhere to be found, and systematic killings are reduced to a footnote about strict rules. History has been curated for tourist consumption. When the palace was transformed into a museum in 1924, workers discovered hidden rooms behind false walls. They found human remains. Under marble floors, bones were uncovered. Restoration revealed 17 different burial sites within the palace walls, though the exact number of bodies was never determined. Modern Turkey's relationship with this history is complex. School textbooks mention the harem as part of Ottoman culture, but focus on architecture and administration, minimizing or ignoring the human cost. When feminist historians raise these issues, they are accused of attacking Turkish heritage. The empire may be gone, but its defenders remain. Romanticization in the media worsens the situation. Every year, new TV shows and films portray life in the harem as an exotic romance. Magnificent Century, Turkey's most popular historical drama, turned Roxolana into a love story. They showcase silks and jewels rather than strangulation and beheading, dramatizing palace intrigues rather than systematic femicide. Archaeological evidence continues to emerge, refusing to let history remain buried. In 2010, during construction near Topkapi, a mass grave was discovered. Forensic examination revealed that 90% of the remains belonged to women aged 15 to 25, many showing signs of violence. The construction was quietly relocated, and the bones were reburied without ceremony. The past was literally covered up again. Modern historians face a difficult struggle. Dr. Melan Zilfi, author of Women and Slavery in the Late Ottoman Empire, received death threats. Dr. Leslie Pierce has been accused of spreading Western propaganda. Academic conferences on Ottoman slavery provoke protests, and truth is perceived as an attack, even though the evidence is undeniable. Digitization of Ottoman archives has opened previously inaccessible documents, and every year, new evidence of systematic horrors appears. Commodity receipts for people, orders for the execution of pregnant women, budget allocations for disposal, services. The bureaucracy of death left too much paper trail to hide. The lesson is especially relevant today. Every wedding photo taken in Topkapi Palace is set on bones, and every tourist admiring Ottoman architecture walks on tiles that once bore witness to crimes. Gardens they photograph were fertilized with human remains. Beauty was built on horror. This is Ottoman heritage. Some argue that history cannot be judged by modern standards, claiming that slavery was common and every empire committed atrocities. But such reasoning ignores scale and systematization. The Ottomans did not merely own slaves, they industrialized human disposal. They did not simply treat women cruelly, they bureaucratized femicide. The harem system serves as a warning for today. It shows how cruelty becomes normalized when cloaked in tradition, how treachery is justified by religion, how economic interests override human rights, how educated people can commit atrocities, and how victims can become accomplices to survive. What does this 5-century nightmare teach us? The answer requires confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature, institutional evil, and our capacity to forget horrors that do not fit preferred narratives. It began with simple statistics. 400 women entered, 3 survived. Now you understand the human reality behind those numbers. The silver tray used to select victims, the silk cords used to strangle them, the leather bags used to drown them, the palace walls that buried them. This was not random cruelty. It was systematic femicide honed over 500 years. The Ottoman Empire created a machine that consumed people with bureaucratic efficiency, with budget lines for killings, standards for execution quality, and certification of performers. They turned violence into education, slavery into culture, and murder into administration. They built the most beautiful death factory in human history. And yet, the final revelation about human capacity for systematic evil is chilling. It was not monsters who ran this system. Men who strangled women returned home to families. Eunuchs, selecting victims for death, mutilated themselves. Women overseeing harem rules were victims turned accomplices. Ordinary people carried out extraordinary horrors because the system demanded it. Luxury and horror were inseparable, intertwined. The same silk used for beautiful clothes became nooses. The same marble used for architectural wonders concealed bodies. The education produced brilliant administrators and broken children. The very gardens that tourists photograph today were fertilized with human remains. Beauty and cruelty were not opposites. They were inseparable. And partners, let me return to that silver tray. This simple object, a metal artifact that could sit in any museum, bore names signifying life or death. Women feared its appearance for years. Some poisoned themselves to avoid being selected. Others prayed to be chosen, believing that power meant safety. Both groups were wrong. Under the tray, there was no choice. It carried death with different timelines. What this reveals about power and violence extends beyond the Ottoman Empire. When people can own other people, horror follows. When traditions justify cruelty, cruelty becomes tradition. When economic interests conflict with human rights, people lose. When violence is institutionalized, institutions become violent. These are not merely historical lessons, they are warnings. Similar systems exist today in various forms. Human trafficking generates $150 billion annually. 15 million women are affected by forced marriages. Honor killings claim 5,000 lives each year. Methods evolve, but the mentality remains. Some people see others as property, using tradition and religion to justify horrors. The importance of remembering accurately cannot be overstated. When we romanticize the past, we enable the present. Every bottle of Haram Nights perfume insults the memory of 1,000 murdered women. Every exoticized story of the Ottoman Empire condones systematic rape. Every embellished historical drama erases real suffering. Memory is crucial because forgetting enables repetition. The human capacity to normalize cruelty should frighten us. The Ottoman Palace operated for 500 years. 1 million people participated, buying, selling, guarding, killing. It was not hidden. Foreign envoys wrote reports. Travelers described the horrors. Yet it continued because people can normalize anything, given enough time and justification. Let's take a moment to consider gratitude. Tonight, you will sleep without fearing the silver tray. Your natural biological functions will not result in execution. Your children will not be taken by state officials. Your name will not appear on any human inventory list. These freedoms, which seem basic, were denied to 1 million people throughout history and are still denied to millions today. Yet gratitude should feed vigilance. The Ottoman Harem system did not appear overnight. It developed through small compromises, gradual normalization, and systematic desensitization. Each generation inherited slightly worse conditions until horror became a legacy. This is how systematic violence always works, incrementally, with seemingly benign justifications. Modern human rights exist because people fought against such systems. Every safeguard in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights responds to historical horrors. Article 4 prohibits slavery because of systems like the harem. Article 5 prohibits torture because of normalized cruelty. Article 16 protects marital rights because of forced cohabitation. Our rights are written in the blood of history's victims. Your personal freedom is not guaranteed. It must be protected and actively defended. When you witness violated human dignity, remember the women of the harem who had no voice. When traditions justify violence, remember how Ottoman officials justified killings with religion. When economic arguments override human rights, remember budget lines and bureaucratic strangulation. The 5th-century nightmare of the Ottoman harem ended not through moral awakening, but through civilizational collapse. The empire had to be destroyed to free its victims. This is a final, chilling confirmation that entrenched systems of abuse rarely reform themselves. They must be dismantled, their defenders confronted, and their justifications exposed. Every time we forget historical horrors, we edge closer to their repetition. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but the mentality that created the harem system persists. Wherever people become commodities, where traditions justify violence, where power operates without accountability, the Palace of Nightmares was destroyed, but its blueprints remain in human nature. I leave you with this thought. Now you know what 99% of people do not, the truth about one of history's most romanticized institutions. You understand the systematic horror hiding behind silk and marble. You have seen how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil when systems demand it. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you be just another tourist, taking selfies on sites of terror? Will you consume romanticized versions of real atrocities? Or will you remember the 397 women lost for every 3 who survived? Will you recognize modern systems of abuse hiding behind tradition and economy? Will you speak out when others prefer silence? The women of the Ottoman Harem could not speak for themselves. The children of the Devshirme left no memoirs. Victims of systematic disposal have no graves to visit. Yet their suffering echoes through history, warning us that civilization and barbarism can coexist, that beauty can mask horror, and that humans can normalize any atrocity given enough time and justification.